Hello and welcome to the Following Truth podcast, a podcast dedicated to sharing the truth about what the Bible really says. I'm your host LJ. This is part 2 of a two-part episode entitled, Did Jesus Die on the Cross? Part 2, the stake versus the cross. We have already seen in part 1 that the Greek word translated as cross is stauros. However, it is claimed by some, including and specifically the Jehovah's Witnesses, that stauros actually means stake, and not in fact cross. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus was not crucified on the cross, as is most commonly believed throughout Christianity, but that he was killed on a single piece of wood, or a stake. The Jehovah's Witnesses claim that the Bible does not in fact describe the shape of the instrument of Jesus' death, but does give evidence that it was a stake and not a cross, and therefore the correct translation is stake. The Jehovah's Witness website states, many view the cross as the most common symbol of Christianity. However, the Bible does not describe the instrument of Jesus' death, so no one can know its shape with absolute certainty. Still, the Bible provides evidence that Jesus died not on a cross, but on an upright stake. Interestingly, the main biblical evidence that is presented by the Jehovah's Witnesses is simply the word translated as cross, stauros, and argue that it means stake and not cross. This in essence is the biblical evidence that the Jehovah's Witnesses allude to, which in fact requires extra biblical evidence to support it. The New World Translation translates stauros as torture stake, Matthew 27:40, and saying, "You, who would throw down the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are a son of God, come down off the torture stake." Interestingly, the New World Translation adds the word torture before the translation of stake. It must be noted that regardless of the correct translation of stauros, the word torture is not found in any verse preceding or succeeding stauros. Even if stake was the correct translation, it would be simply stake and not torture stake. Torture has been added to the New World Translation when it is not stated in the Greek, although we must at least acknowledge that the stake would indeed be a stake where torture occurred, even though that torture would lead to eventual death, so it would maybe better be rendered death stake, but that could simply be nitpicking. Neither exist in the actual text. Most other Bibles do translate stauros as cross, even the NIV and the ESV, just as the KJV does. Also using cross is the NLT, BSB, NASB, CSB, CEV, GNT, ISV, the Net Bible, the ASV, the Douay Rheims, Darby Bible, ERV, YLT, to name just a few. The Jehovah's Witness website further states, according to a critical lexicon and concordance to the English and Greek New Testament, stauros never means two pieces of wood joining each other at any angle. Now, if this is correct and stauros never means two pieces of wood joining each other at any angle, then we must ask as to why the Jehovah's Witnesses have not always taught this. The Jehovah's Witnesses have not always believed that Jesus died on a stake. The Jehovah's Witnesses arose from a group that was started by Charles Taze Russell in the late 1870s. For around 50 to 60 years, they believed in and taught the cross of Jesus. It was stated in a 1929 edition of Life, Jesus was crucified upon the cross, Life 1929, page 216. Joseph Franklin Rutherford, in his 1921 book, The Harp of God, referred to the cross of Christ as the greatest pivotal truth of divine arrangement. The cross of Christ is the greatest pivotal truth of the divine arrangement from which radiate the hopes of men. The Harp of God, J.F. Rutherford, page 141. J.F. Rutherford was the second president of the Incorporated Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. Rutherford played a major role in the Jehovah's Witness organization and the formation of their doctrine. It was Rutherford himself that would move the belief away from the cross to the stake. He wrote in his 1936 book, Riches, Jesus was crucified, not on a cross of wood, such as exhibited in many images and pictures, and which images are made and exhibited by men, Jesus was crucified by nailing his body to a tree. Riches, page 27. Clearly, Rutherford had no problems with the term crucified. Rather, it was what Jesus was crucified on which bore the objection. Also, the cross was used as a symbol that was included on the cover of The Watchtower, all the way up until October of 1931. The cross symbol was removed and not included on the cover of the renamed The Watchtower for the 15th of October 1931 edition. Until the publication of the New World Translation New Testament in the 1950s and the full Bible in the 1960s, most Jehovah's Witnesses actually used the King James Bible. The King James Version translates stauros as cross. The Jehovah's Witness website states that God rejects worship that uses images or symbols, including the cross. So we must ask what happened to the Jehovah's Witnesses' own followers who believed in and were taught the cross before the cross was removed. It's important to take note of the actual language used in the claim of the Jehovah'sWitness.org website. According to a critical lexicon and concordance in the English and Greek New Testament, a critical lexicon. This indicates one singular critical lexicon, even though they do not state which critical lexicon this is. When we look at some of the well-known concordances, we see that stauros, which is Strong's Greek word 4716, while it can mean upright stake or pole, it does have the meaning cross. Strong's itself states that stauros is an upright stake or a cross. So what does stauros really mean? This really is the crux of the matter, excuse the pun. While I do not think that this is so much a theological issue, what matters is that Jesus did in fact die and that he did in fact resurrect. I do think it opens up the question, can we trust the Bible? And is the Bible accurate? So I do think that the issue is at least worthy of study, and do not think that it is simply a waste of time. I think that any group that brings doubt to either of these issues needs to be addressed. The Jehovah's Witnesses actually do rather make this a big issue. I will not be making much of an argument in this podcast for the traditional T-shaped cross, as I actually think that there is compelling evidence that the cross of Jesus was actually an X-shape. I shall do this in another podcast. The argument here will be more centered around the use of more than one piece of timber, as opposed to the singular stake that the Jehovah's Witnesses assert. The Jehovah's Witness website offers the following evidence for stauros meaning stake. The Greek word rendered cross in many Bible versions is stauros. In classical Greek, this word meant merely an upright stake, or pale. Later, it also came to be used for an execution stake having a crosspiece. The Imperial Bible Dictionary acknowledges this, saying, the Greek word for cross, stauros, properly signified a stake, an upright pole or piece of paling, in which anything might be hung, or which might be used in impaling, fencing in, a piece of ground. Even amongst the Romans, the crux, from which our cross is derived, appears to have been originally an upright pole. Edited by P. Fairbairn, London 1874, Volume 1, page 376. However, this is simply very, very disingenuous. Not only have they removed words, they have cut short the writing itself. Now let's have a look at the words removed. But a modification was introduced as the dominion and usages of Rome extended themselves throughout the Greek-speaking countries. I think that speaks for itself. A modification was introduced to stauros as Rome extended themselves through the Greek-speaking countries. Now, as I said, they not only removed these rather important words, but also cut short the writing itself. So let's see what they left off. And it's not just a single word or even two. It in fact is not even a single sentence, but a huge portion of the writing. And this always remained the most prominent part, but from the time that it began to be used as an instrument of punishment, a transverse piece of wood was commonly added, not, however, always even then, for it would seem that there were more kinds of death than one by the cross, this being sometimes accomplished by transfixing the criminal with a pole, which was run through his back and spine and came out through his mouth. In another place, Seneca mentions 3 different forms. I see, says he, 3 crosses, not indeed of one sort, but fashioned in different ways. One sort suspended by the head, persons bent toward the earth, others transfixing them through their secret parts, others extending their arms on a patibulum. There can be no doubt, however, that the latter sort was the more common, and that about the period of the Gospel age, crucifixion was usually accomplished by suspending the criminal on a cross piece of wood. When a text has to be edited in such a way in order to make it support your position and then offered as evidence, then it is deliberately being deceiving, and it must be asked as to what purpose this was done. It has to be questioned as to what agenda were the words that actually negate the position being presented were removed. Maybe that's something that the jehovahswitness.org website should address. The Jehovah's Witness website also states, the Bible generally uses the Greek word stauros when referring to the instrument of Jesus' execution. Although translations often render this word cross, many scholars agree that its basic meaning is actually upright stake. Now it is very true, just as the jehovahswitnesses.org correctly states that the Greek word stauros did mean an upright stake. The basic meaning is upright stake, not torture stake as we have already established. I will not be arguing with the many scholars who, it must be stated, remain unnamed and anonymous at this point. The Jehovah's Witnesses point to Homer, a classical Greek poet who lived around the late 8th or early 7th century BC, who used the word to mean stake, although other classic Greek writers could be cited. Homer did use the word in connection with stake, as correctly stated by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. Homer used the word stake in the Odyssey, which is dated to around the 8th century BC. Without, he had driven stakes, stauros, the whole length, this way and that, huge stakes, set close together, which he had made by splitting an oak to the black core. Homer, the Odyssey, 14.11. However, we do have to take into account that Homer wrote in classical Greek. The Bible was not written in classical Greek but Koine Greek, something that the Jehovah's Witnesses seem able to ignore. We cannot simply take the meaning of the word in a different dialect, as in classical Greek, and insist that it must mean the same, or that it cannot also have a different or secondary meaning in a different dialect, namely Koine Greek. But what it does show is that stauros did mean stake, and maybe the point previously referred to may be mute, as stauros, it must be stated, does, even to this day, have the meaning stake. Of this there is simply no denying. But to stop there, as the Jehovah's Witness organization does, is simply wrong. There is much more information that needs to be examined, and plenty more evidence to be presented. It is simply dishonest to say that the word can have no other meaning than the one first implied. This is a fallacy that the Jehovah's Witnesses commit. We know that the Romans later conquered the Greeks. This was done a long time after Homer, but also a long time before the arrival of Jesus the Messiah. Despite being under the authority of the Roman Empire, Greek remained the common language used by those that used to belong to the Grecian Empire. The Romans, however, did install much of their authority onto these peoples, including the Roman means of punishment, namely crucifixion. Crucifixion, and this is rather important, was not part of the Grecian custom, and so they had no technical term for it. So they had to come up with a term that would suit. The Greek language that did not have a word for crucifixion now required one. It also needed a word for the object on which the crucifixion took place. The Greek-speaking world had a few options open to them, just as today in modern language when something new is introduced into our culture. 1. We invent a new word, like the word internet, for example. This was invented in the 1970s, denoting a computer network connecting two or more smaller networks, from inter, reciprocal, mutual, plus network. The word internet was invented in the 1970s to name something that had previously not existed. 2. Use the Roman word either directly or Grecianizing it. We do this all the time in modern languages. Damsel is an anglicization of the Old French damoiselle, meaning young lady. Or 3. Completely change the meaning of an already existing word. An example of a word completely changing meaning would be the word gay. Today the word means a homosexual person. However, this is not the original meaning. The original meaning of the word meant to be happy or cheerful. Let's take the 1941 Warner Brothers film, The Gay Parisian. The meaning of the word gay has changed since the film was made. It would be incorrect to take a modern understanding of the word gay and interject that meaning back into the film that was made before the meaning of the word changed. It would totally distort the true meaning of the film. The film has absolutely nothing to do with homosexuality whatsoever. The same would be true if we took the meaning of the word gay from 1941 and interjected it into the modern term LGBT. We would now have the meaning lesbian, happy, bisexual, transgender. Although I'm sure the LGBT community are happy, this rendering would completely change and distort the actual meaning of the term. This would again simply be an incorrect thing to do, as the word gay in this term does not refer to somebody being happy or cheerful. 4. Use a previously used word, adding a meaning to it. Just like the word mouse. Mouse originally, and still means, a small rodent that typically has a pointed snout, relatively large ears and eyes, and a long tail. However, the word mouse also has another, more modern meaning. A small handheld device which is moved across a mat or flat surface to move the cursor on a computer screen. A previously used word with a totally different meaning was used. Since the introduction of the computer mouse, the word mouse has had two meanings, and not understanding that the word has two meanings could lead to confusion. A non-functioning computer or a pet that really doesn't do much apart from sit in its cage could be the result. If someone said that they had just bought a new mouse for their computer, and you took only the basic and original meaning of the word and applied it to their statement, you would get a completely incorrect understanding of what the person has just purchased. It would also work the opposite way. If they said that they had just purchased a pet mouse and you applied the modern meaning of the word, you are only going to confuse the true meaning of the statement and get a very incorrect understanding. The thought of someone buying a computer mouse to keep in a cage as a pet is somewhat funny. This is how language adapts and changes. This adaptation has been named by linguists as the diacritic development of languages. Again, it is simply disingenuous to say that we can only take the basic meaning, or the original meaning, or even the modern meaning of a word and say no other meaning should be or can be applied. In order to correctly understand the meaning of the usage of the word, we must allow the context in which the statement is made to dictate which meaning is being applied. The Greeks chose to use a previously used word and add a meaning unto it. The Greek word stauros was used, and the meaning cross was added to the meaning stake. Therefore, stauros could from then on be rendered stake or cross, depending on the context in which the word was used. Anyone who seems to doubt what the word means and what the Greeks themselves understood what stauros meant only need to look at a church building of the Greek Orthodox Church and they will see a cross and not a stake adorning its exterior. The Greeks fully understood the word stauros to mean a device of more than one piece of timber, in this case in the shape of a cross. So what about the biblical evidence? There is not much biblically supporting evidence for the cross apart from the translation of cross itself. However, we do have a couple of passages that make much more sense when cross is understood to be the correct translation. Firstly, we have the comment of Thomas, who wanted to see the print of the nails, plural, in the hands of Jesus, nails indicating more than one nail was used. This would be unlikely if the hands of Jesus were placed together above him. Had the hands of Jesus been above his head rather than outstretched, one single nail would most likely have been used, just as the Jehovah's Witnesses' own imagery would indicate. The New World Translation also uses the plural nails, contrary to their own imagery. We also have the wording regarding the placement of the sign at his crucifixion. Had the hands of Jesus been placed up and above his head, then the passage regarding the placement of the sign at his death becomes rather confusing. Matthew 27:37, and set up over his head his accusation, written, "This is the King of the Jews." The language used here would indicate that the sign went above his head. If the arms of Jesus were above his head, then although it would technically be correct to say the sign was above his head, if it was placed above the hands, as they would also have been above his head, the language used here would be rather strange. It would be much more likely and grammatically correct that it would be stated above his hands. However, this is not in itself concrete proof, just simple grammatical evidence. We can also look at the language used by Jesus to signify the ultimate death of the disciple Peter. John 21:18, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee, when thou wast young, thou girdest thyself, and walkest whither thou wouldest. But when thou shalt be old, thou shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee, and carry thee whither thou wouldest not." Here Jesus talks about stretching his hands, which is possibly alluding to the outstretched arms of crucifixion. It is understood that Peter was also crucified, although upside down. Probably the best biblical support for the cross, however, is where we are told Jesus carried his cross. This is often overlooked, and its importance often simply brushed by. John 19:17, "And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha." I'm sure most people have seen pictures or films that depict Jesus literally carrying the full cross upon his back. However, that likely isn't what is being portrayed at all. It is much more likely, even if not undeniably, that this was a biblical reference to the very historically attested to form of Roman punishment known as patibulum, crossbeam bearing, where the criminal would be forced to carry not the full cross, but the crossbeam of the cross on their back and their shoulders through the city or public places. I will look into the evidence of this in just a moment. The Watchtower claims that the crux, which is the Latin translation of stauros, also meant a stake, and only later came to mean cross. The original meanings of these words, stauros and crux, were later expanded to include the cross. Watchtower, 15th of February 1960, page 127. True, the Romans did use an instrument of execution known in Latin as the crux, and in translating the Bible into Latin, this word crux was used as a rendering of stauros, because the Latin word crux and the English word cross are similar. Many mistakenly assumed that the crux was necessarily a stake with a crossbeam. 15th of August 1987, Watchtower, page 23. The English word cross is derived from the Latin crux. The Jehovah's Witnesses claim that the T-shape was introduced much later in history. Again, I should not go into too much detail in the argument for or against the shape T in this podcast. I shall do that in another podcast. Rather, all that needs to be shown for the argument regarding the cross, whatever shape that be, is to show that 1. Stauros was used to refer to the crux, the Roman instrument of execution, and 2. The Roman instrument of execution, the crux, could consist of more than one piece of timber at the time of the execution of Jesus. The crux referred to the instrument on which the Romans implemented their crucifixions. The Romans didn't really have any particular preference to a certain shape on which they performed these executions. They would execute using many different shaped devices. The Romans called a single beam device a crux simplex, and a multiple beam device a crux compacta. The simple fact that the Romans had to distinguish between a single-beamed crux and a multiple-beamed crux clearly indicates that not all executions were performed on a single-beam device. We have evidence of the cross or crux compacta that certainly predate Constantine, one such being from Justin Martyr, 114 to 167 CE. For the beam is placed upright, from which the highest extremity is raised up into its horn, when the other beam is fitted onto it, and the ends appear on both sides as horns joined onto the one horn. Although Martyr doesn't specifically make reference to the shape of a cross, the fact that he refers to the other beam clearly indicates more than one beam, and therefore whatever shape the more than one beam made, it was more than one single beam, as the Jehovah's Witnesses would assert. More importantly, though, to the argument is that there are historical writings that predate the death of Jesus that show that stauros was being used to describe the Roman instrument of execution. Greek historian Polybius, who lived from 200 to 118 BC, describing an event that occurred in 183 BC. All the baggage fell off the hands of the enemy, and Hannibal himself was made a prisoner. They, the Roman soldiers, at once took him up on the cross, stauron, on which Spendius was hanging, and after the infliction of exquisite tortures, took down the latter's body, and fastened Hannibal, still living, to his cross, stauron. Here Polybius used the word stauron to refer to the instrument of execution used by the Romans. Chariton, written somewhere between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, they found the others already hanging on their crosses, stauros, and he was just mounting his cross. From far off they each shouted appeals, "Spare him, come down, do not hurt him, let him go." So the executioner stopped his work, and Chaereas descended from the cross, regretfully, for he had been glad to be leaving his miserable life and unhappy love. Again, here's stauros very clearly being used to describe the instrument of execution. Philo of Alexandria, 25 BC to 50 AD, wrote about the instrument of execution also using stauros. The relations and friends of those who were real victims were led away to prison, were scourged, were tortured, and after the ill treatment which their living bodies could endure, found the cross, stauros, the end of all, and the punishment from which they could not escape. Plutarch, who lived between 45 AD and 127 AD. But will you nail him to a cross, or impale him to a stake? What does Theodorus care whether he rots above the ground or beneath? Plutarch not only referred to the instrument of execution by using stauros, he also differentiated the stauron from the stake, which was scolopi. Although many other examples could be cited as evidence, the examples presented show adequate proof that the Greek stauron was being used to refer to the Roman instrument of execution, not just at the time of Jesus, but also before. So if it can be shown that the Roman instrument of execution could include a cross, a device consisting of more than one piece of timber, then it would provide ample support that stauros could be used to describe the instrument of execution used by the Romans that consisted of more than one piece of timber or simple stake. And it just happens that we do have that historical evidence. Plautus, 254 to 184 BC, wrote in his play Miles Gloriosus, "I suspect you're doomed to die outside the gate, in that position, hands spread out and nailed to the patibulum." Here, Plautus clearly states that the arms would be stretched out, not above the head, and nailed to the patibulum, or the crossbeam. In another play, Mostelleria, Plautus uses the term double-nailed. "I'll give £200 to the first man to charge my crux and take it, on condition his legs and his arms are double-nailed, that is." Double-nailed is another clear alluding to requiring more than one nail, which indicates that the crux being a cross shape and not a single beam. And again, Plautus highlights the punishment of patibulum, the carrying of the crossbeam by the criminal and then being nailed to the crux. Let him bear the patibulum through the city, then let him be nailed to the crux. Two very clear and distinct parts, clearly showing two, not one being. Tacitus, AD 56 to 120. The soldiers stationed to supervise the tribute were seized and nailed to the patibulum. Seneca, 4 BC to AD 65. Though they strive to release themselves from their crosses, those crosses to which each one of you nails himself with his own hand, yet they, when brought to punishment, hang each one on a single stripes. But these others, who bring upon themselves their own punishment, are stretched upon as many crosses as they had desires. Yet they are slanderous and witty in heaping insults on others. I might believe that they were free to do so. Did not some of them spit upon spectators from their own patibulum? There are many other examples that could be cited. As it has been shown that instruments of execution that consisted of more than one piece of timber were being used by the Romans at the time of Jesus, then it would have to be shown by the Jehovah's Witnesses that another word, and not stauros, was used to refer to that particular instrument of execution. The argument that Jesus died on a stake and not on a cross, the shape being irrelevant to the argument, fails when it is examined in more detail. It would seem that the Jehovah's Witnesses are so concerned with the shape, specifically the T-shaped cross, that they are willing to dishonestly argue for a single-beamed stake. There is more than enough supporting evidence that Jesus died on a device that consisted of two pieces of wood. Thank you very much for listening to the Following Truth podcast. I hope the information has been useful, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.